Okay, we'll switch gears and talk about some racial diversity in the Ozarks. And I don't think we've talked a lot about slavery in here this semester, but certainly Missouri and Arkansas were slave states before the Civil War, and slavery was spread across the Ozarks. There were some areas of the Ozarks where you had slaves in pretty significant numbers, and other areas of the Ozarks where you didn't have slaves at all for large sections of land. Now this figure, in 1860, the year before the Civil War starts, this figure of 29,000 slaves in the Ozarks is a very rough figure, and what I did to arrive at that number is I took pretty much all of the Ozarks counties. Remember back the first week or two of the semester when we did our Ozarks map and we had all those counties and we had the border around the Ozarks? Pretty much if the county appeared on that map, I counted it. So that means that a lot of these counties are border Ozarks counties, and a lot of the counties where the heaviest slave concentrations were along the Missouri River, along the Arkansas River, on the borders of the region, and they were more river valley counties than they were real Ozarks counties. So that number is really inflated, but still there were thousands of slaves in the Ozarks at the time of the Civil War, no matter how you do the math. If you take the number there, that was over 6% of the population. And I would say probably a more accurate number would be somewhere around 4 or 5% of the Ozarks population would have been composed of slaves. So small compared to most of the South, most of the slaveholding states. That's a small percentage, but more significant than you might think in a place like the Ozarks, which for much of the 20th century and into the 21st century had the reputation of being a sort of lily-white area where there were very, very few blacks. There was a larger percentage of the black population in the Ozarks in those days than there is today. Now, as I mentioned, lots of counties had very few, if any, slaves, and some of them had quite a few. There were, as you can see there, in 21 counties in the Ozarks, slaves made up less than 1% of the population, so slavery was almost non-existent in 21 counties. There was one county in the Ozarks that did not have a single slave at the time of the Civil War. Anybody want to guess what it was?
No, I said where, but...
Okay. We'll find out. One county had no slave. It was Douglas County. Yeah, that's what. Douglas County did not have a slave, or at least at the time of the 1860 census, a year before the Civil War broke out, there were no slaves in Douglas County, and there were several other counties where you might have a dozen or fewer than 50 slaves altogether. But Douglas was the one county. I don't know if it was the only county in Missouri without a slave, but it was certainly the only county in the Ozarks. It's that there's no sort of industry, no extractive industry in Douglas County, and there's also no plantation agriculture in Douglas County. Douglas County, like many of the Ozark counties, is rugged. There's very little flat land down there. About the only really fertile agricultural land you would have is in a river or creek bottom somewhere, and that's even pretty narrow in Douglas County, in Ozark County, and Wright County, and a lot of places like that. But you'd think that there would have been a slave owner somewhere passing through Douglas County, as plentiful as slaves were in Arkansas and Missouri at that time, but it was the one county that didn't. And as Sierra mentioned, the counties like St. Francis and Washington, these were both mining counties. We've already talked about the lead industry, and a lot of the manual labor used in lead mining, going all the way back to the days of Moses Austin and even to the French before Moses Austin got here, was done by slaves. So that probably accounted for a pretty significant proportion of the slaves in that area. And other places like Cole County, Cooper County, these are Missouri River Valley counties, and it's probably a little, Cooper County, you can see almost 22% slave in 1860. Not a place that most of us would consider part of the Ozarks today, and they certainly wouldn't consider themselves part of the Ozarks in Cooper County, or Cole County for that matter. But Greene County is on the list. Over 10% of the population of Greene County here in Springfield was slave, and some of those would have been industrial type slaves working in the milling industry as blacksmiths or other things around Springfield. Some of them would have been agricultural slaves. There would have been a diversity of uses for slaves in those days, and some of the slaves were skilled workers. And it was very common in the Ozarks for slave owners to rent their slaves out and to receive pay from an industrialist or a farmer or something like that for use of a slave. Mainly because it's on the river. It's fertile river valley land up there, and that's really more in the kind of an extension of the Little Dixie area of central Missouri, where you have plantation agriculture. You would have had several plantations in Cooper County that you wouldn't see necessarily in the Ozarks. There were some plantations in the Ozarks, but they were few and far between compared to most other places in the South.
That 10% in Greene County surprises me.
Mm-hmm.
How did they get here? Were they, in the South there were slave auctions and things
Right.
like that.
Yeah, Millie asks how the slaves got here, specifically the 10% plus in Greene County. Most of them were brought with the settlers, early settlers. Many of the early settlers to the Ozarks, very few of them had large numbers of slaves, but it was very common for the settlers to own a slave or two, maybe a slave family, and to bring them with them. That's how most of them got here, yeah.
What happened after the Civil War when the slaves were supposedly free
Right.
to that 10% here?
Right. What happened to the 10% after the Civil War? It actually, in Greene County, it increases. And in Springfield, it increases. The black population grew significantly after the Civil War in the late 1800s up until an event that we'll talk about in a minute that kind of puts a halt to that and even causes it to slow down. Springfield became a kind of a magnet for freed blacks in the Ozarks, southwest Missouri, northwest Arkansas, because there was a sizable black community in Springfield. It attracted others to come here. They had their own businesses, their own business section, and professionals and things like that. And it was really a unique case in the Ozarks where you had a critical mass of black people to have that kind of little enclave in Springfield that you didn't get in other smaller towns in the Ozarks.
Was that in North Springfield?
I don't. My guess is I really don't know enough details about the black community in Springfield to know. I'm guessing there wasn't just one community where they lived. The population would have been large enough where they could have been scattered around Springfield. But I really don't know the details of Springfield's black community. There are some good sources for that. The Springfield Greene County Library has some online documents relating to the history of the black community here in Springfield and in Greene County in general. And there were smaller rural black communities here in Greene County that were not in Springfield, farming communities at the old community they called No-Go out northeast of Springfield, out sort of south of I-44, northeast of Springfield. That was a black community, and there was one out around in the Willard area. Cave Spring was the name of that one. And there was another one out sort of due east of Springfield, Danforth, the Danforth Church community out there. So there were several of those communities. And in neighboring counties as well, one of the, the better known rural black communities in southwest Missouri and the Missouri Ozarks was over in the Hartville area in Wright County. And that community held on for several years. And certainly in Arkansas you had similar situations. Fayetteville, which is in Washington County, Arkansas, became sort of northwest Arkansas's center, at least for a small black community. There was a pretty vibrant black community there, and there were lots of rural black settlements as well in the Arkansas Ozarks.